Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story. It's Thursday. We're in Micah 6 and the first part of chapter 7. And I'm going to read a few verses from Micah 6. It says, what can we bring to the Lord? Should we bring him burnt offerings? Should we bow before God Most High with offerings and yearling calves? Should we offer him thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Should we sacrifice our firstborn to pay for our sins? No, old people. No, old people. It sounded like I said old people. The Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you: to do what is right, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Fear the Lord if you are wise. His voice calls to everyone in Jerusalem. So, it says, this is what the Lord requires: do what is right, love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. This verse, along with some others, kind of gets quoted together. But when I read this, do what is right, love mercy, those two things, what I see is a picture of church to me. Meaning it feels like in church, people fall in one or two camps. They're either the do what is right people, or they're the love mercy people. But the two are very difficult to blend. So why does the church seem to divide in two camps, holiness and righteousness versus social justice? Because there are other verses that talk about, God doesn't want to fast. He wants you to take care of the poor, the widows, da-da-da-da. So
I think it's because sometimes naturally people fall into one of those camps just by what they're called to, or just like what's natural to them. There are people who it's a lot easier for them to go and serve at a soup kitchen than it is for them to improve their life or their relationship with God, right? And for other people, it's like they can focus on growing in Christ or going to church every Sunday and those things, but then they have no desire whatsoever to do anything for anyone else, And so I think that even though we might naturally fall into one of those camps, we have to be pushed out of our comfort zone, and because it is a full package, right? Like we should be, even if we're not necessarily naturally passionate about both, we need to be in both.
Yeah, I would agree that we tend to lean one way or the other, and that can be how we're hardwired. It can be what we grew up in, what we were exposed to. When the reality is that there should be a balance to it. I think the last part of that verse, and to walk humbly with your God, will necessitate and facilitate the other aspects of the previous part of the verse of doing what's right, to love mercy, is when we walk with God. That's a deep, intimate relationship, and out of that, I think grows the realization for the need of the other, and even perhaps a heart change for some of that. And I'm just speaking openly. The way I view people now is different than the way I viewed people maybe 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, certainly 30 years ago. And I like to think it's because of the relationship with God that he continues to work and change me, so that not only do I want to do what is right, but to love mercy and to love my fellow man, and to look for opportunities, like you said, to serve people. And I think that develops out of the walk with God.
Yeah, so earlier this week, I made a reference about legalism and lawlessness. And there are multiple pieces to this, I think. You talked about how you were raised. I do think that how you were historically raised has some bearing on it. We grew up in a holiness environment where everything was, you could look, and you were supposed to be able to look and determine somebody's spiritual how they were living. And today, today there's a generation, particularly behind mine. So I would have kind of been the last of that holiness generation, because that holiness generation spread across denominations. It wasn't just, the Southern Baptists were real hard line. Certainly the Independent Baptists were hard line. All the Pentecostal denominations were very, rigid. And there became this overcorrection, to that's terrible. Y'all, you're kicking people out of the church because they didn't wear stockings or something, drinking Pepsi. That's so the overcorrection comes. And so there's a generation that is behind me, maybe even a couple of generations that feel like, okay, you were too harsh. We gotta let up. The other thing that I think happens is typically as you get older, you become more outwardly holy in acting. So some of it becomes because you just can't do the things you used to do. You're just not physically capable. Some of it comes because you've just gotten old and wise enough. You go, this is stupid. Like, this is killing my marriage. It's killing my kids. It's killing my finances. Like, I can't continue down this path. We can't go clubbing every night. I can't go belly up to the bar every night. Whatever. All of those things that begin to change. And I think that you just begin to see the world differently, and you're like, man, some of that stuff gained me nothing.
Yeah.
And if I could go back and do it over again, I would avoid it.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I hear things. So, like, there's a video clip. I wish I will play for y'all after this is over with, but I can't play it here. But it's a preacher in the denomination I grew up in, and he doesn't pastor the largest church now, but I would guess I wouldn't be surprised if it's not the wealthiest church now, and has been for ages. And he's close to 70-ish, I guess. And when I was 30 years ago, so when I'm a teenager and a young adult, his church is here in North Carolina. And there's a lot of famous people that have attended his church over the years. But he was considered a liberal in the denomination I grew up in, like a heretic. Some people hated him, like literally hated him, because they felt like he was just way too loose for, the church's standards. And I came across a TikTok of all things of him this past week, and I sent it to my dad. I was like, this is hard to believe. So his church right now, they've been for several years having this prayer movement, which is very powerful. But he got up and he said, I got a note here. He said, and I'm trying to decide if it's of the Lord or if it's, and he said his name. He said, so I'm going to read it and you'll just have to decide. And he proceeded to lay in. He talked about, he said, men are sight driven and they're drawn to flesh. And he said, we live in a culture that 360 degrees everywhere they turn. It's low down here and high up here, and everything's out. And he said, our men are exposed to it everywhere. He said, but it ought not to be happening in the house of God. He said, if there's a place that a man ought to come and not have to worry about his eyes being distracted because a woman is showing her cleavage or her butt's hanging out. He just, he goes off. And I'm like, where's this coming from? And he said, and just so you know, I ain't getting complaints about men's shorts being too short. I was caught off guard by it. But from what I understand, I did a little bit of checking. He created quite a stink that his church is near Charlotte. It's in Charlotte. And the Charlotte Observer, he's been in the news a lot over the years. Like one of the things, the church they bought that they're in now, they bought from another church that moved and built this $44 million church and then went bankrupt. And he went in the pulpit on a Sunday night and said, "This church is in a bind." Well, I don't know they went bankrupt, but they couldn't make their payments. He went in the church. The church payment was something like $44,000 a month. It was a stupid amount of money, and it may have been more than that. I don't remember. It may have been $144,000 a month. And he took an offering to pay their church payment for a year and took it up on a Sunday night. So this has been 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So you can understand the money that they've got coming in church. But the Charlotte Observer did, because you would stand in line to get in the church because it was a wait line. And they did an article because he had passed out a paper laying out some modesty standards for people if they were coming in the sanctuary. Like he felt like it was out of hand, and the Charlotte Observer ripped him a new one, but he don't seem to be backing off on it, which seems to be like opposite of what I remember when I was younger. What he focused on. He focused more on the mercy and grace, side. And I think as you get older, you realize that you would be better off if you avoided some of these things that we consider to be legalistic. Can you do X? Well, sure, you can. Is it helping you? It's
wise.
Yeah, it was. It's like I heard Andy Stanley say this. Andy said, "Nobody has ever walked in my office and said, 'Pastor, we were having problems in my marriage, and I started drinking, and suddenly things got better.'" He said, "Nobody's ever done that." He's like, so when you back off and you realize, okay, maybe I wasted some time, and so that's my experience. As I think sometimes as you get older, generational has some of it, but then as you get older, you start to say, that's probably not the best move.
Yeah, I would agree. You change, you grow. I kind of equate it to the process of having grandchildren. You see things differently. There are still standards and things that are acceptable behavior, unacceptable behavior, but all that stuff in the middle, you view a lot of it quite differently now. And you say, man, if I could go back.
Yeah, because your kids probably remarked to you,
"Oh, yeah.
Well, you didn't treat me that way."
Yeah. You let him get away with stuff that you will,
Do you feel guilty about it?
Sometimes very little, but there have been a couple occasions, and on those occasions, I have said to my now adult children, if I could go back, I would have done things differently in regards to that, or my response would have been different, and I apologize for that,
I've done that too, and I would. The second piece of that is I would say, and so you don't do it.
Yeah, and that's right. You learn from my mistake or poor example, even though motive. See, and that's the thing. Motive could have been 100% right, but the actions or responses may not have been the best, and so you view life differently. And I don't think it's any different when you walk with God. You get further down the road, and some things you thought were so important all of a sudden aren't, and maybe some things you didn't think were as important now are. And you adjust accordingly, which I think kind of answers part of that question. Why is there a division between that? Because people, every walk of life, you may be a teen, you may be a young adult, you could be somebody who's well down the road in years, and you view pretty much everything from a different lens.
We're all built different, but yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts, but I don't want to go too. I don't want to make this podcast go too long, so we could talk about it another time. But I think that finding that balance is very important. Both need to be
Jesus
essential.
was full of grace and truth. Both.
Yeah.
There's not the goal is to be full of both. And typically we think we've got to go one way or the other.
I did think of one example. So as we were talking about shorts and things like that. So at my last church, I had my students I knew pretty well. Like if ever there was someone who came in to youth group or something like that with something that you might deem a little inappropriate, right? If they're part of our youth group, I would ask, because if it was a girl, I was not going to be the one to go over and be like, you need to put on some shorts. But I always on hand had extra shorts and extra t-shirts just like available, just in case someone came in with something inappropriate.
That is
curse
very
words,
Holiness Independent Baptist.
which is, I mean, my background is not that, but just because I don't want
Yeah.
them to be uncomfortable either. And so I remember though with like I would ask the female leader, hey, can you like talk with your girl and just say like, hey, like what you're wearing, is not like doesn't like fit within our church guidelines, and like is it okay if you just put on a pair of shorts, something like that? And we just ask them very nicely and off to the side, don't want to embarrass anybody. But then it's interesting because we had a new person come and they had shorts that were fairly short. And they came to youth group. It was their first time there, and I never said anything, and I never asked the leaders to say anything. And one of our students was like, "Hey, she was wearing shorts that were like, from what your rules are, wasn't appropriate." And I just said like, it's important to show grace. We don't want the first experience they have to be like, you need to change.
Well, this church was started out of kept skirts and pants in the lobby.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And if you showed up and you had on shorts as a guy, they'd make you put on a pair of pants. And if you had on pants, you had to put on a skirt. They had a skirt for you.
Well, when we went to the beach day, I specifically texted and emailed everybody to make sure they know no 2-piece bathing suits. Or if you only have a 2-piece bathing suit, you got to put a shirt over it. And one of our boys showed up with a 2-piece bathing suit. It was no, I'm just joking. but I did have extra t-shirts available for the students that forgot. And
I
that was
think
fine.
there's an appropriate way to address those kind of things, because in between podcasts, somehow this came up. Oh, I know. You were telling that ridiculous story, which you're not going to tell on the podcast. We're going to use it as a clip. It wasn't at this church. It was at another church. But they were sharing this situation. This person was sharing this situation. They had been a leader. And they said this person kept wearing skirts that were too short. Right, Jay? Do you remember this conversation? Mm-hmm. And we were all flabbergasted. Like, not that they were wearing skirts that were too short. But he began the conversation. So it's a guy, staff, talk, this was at a different church. It's not here. So it was a guy staff, and he brought this girl in, and he began the conversation by saying, what did he say, Jay?
You have nice thighs.
Yeah, you have nice thighs.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Now I get why you were laughing at my story before. Yeah. You have to follow us, by the way, on Facebook and TikTok to know what we're talking about.
We were all like, you said what? You said you began the conversation. Like, that should never even... Yeah. So here's a modesty conversation.
Yeah.
That should never be a conversation between a people of the opposite sex that are not married.
Yeah, because first of all, the issue was he said he dealt with it. And the question was, how'd you deal with it? And that was the response.
Right.
Like, that's not a response.
Yeah, but you got to cover them up. No, that's a pickup line.
Yeah.
That's not a way you address it. And so it's important that those issues are addressed in the right way too. So.
Yeah, because we want to show grace, but also too we want to it's the balance.
Right.
It's the balance.
Well, let's wind this modesty issue down. Thank you for joining us today on One Single Story. We hope you'll be back tomorrow as we finish up our conversation about the book of Micah.